Welcome back and welcome to the second half of the lecture video for this module period. Like I mentioned in the previous video, in this video, we are going to start thinking more about what epistemic oppression looks like in conversation. So one thing I just want to clarify right off the bat is that there's a lot of ways that this is going to show up in conversation. Hermeneutical impasses is just a specific way that we could conceptualize some of the epistemic oppression that crops up in communication, and as you either have seen or you will see, both in the article by Lavelle Anderson as well as his video. There's going to be a lot of ways that this concept of hermeneutical impasses links up really nicely with the things that we have been talking about in this class, in this course on critical reasoning. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so now, like I said, we are going to start thinking about how epistemic oppression sometimes, not always, happens in conversations. All right. Okay. Hermeneutical impasses. Don't feel bad if you feel like you're never going to be able to pronounce that word. It took me teaching this class for many semesters before I feel I really got the hang of it. And it is a long, complicated word that essentially all it means, it's sort of like a really broad term that we could use to describe concepts that we use as tools for understanding. And Lavelle Anderson argues that we experience these sorts of what we might call an impasse in like the hermeneutical resources that two parties have available when you have two people that are communicating, right? So they were like relying on some concepts to communicate some stuff. Don't worry if that sounds too weird and abstract. We'll nail it down with an example in a second. But you have two people that are like having some conversation that are unable to achieve understanding due to a gap. They don't share the same, they don't have overlapping sets of hermeneutical resources. And as a result, they fail to understand each other. Okay, so I know that sounds like kind of a complicated way to explain something. So let's go back to this concept again of what counts as a hermeneutical resource. Like I mentioned, it's like a nice big broad term to capture all of the different kinds of ideas that we use to communicate with one another and make sense of the world. So what do we mean like concepts and expressive tools used for communicating our experiences and like knowledge and other stuff with one another? What do we mean by that? Well, I think a really great place to start with sort of wrapping our head around what this like hermeneutical resource looks like are memes. So I think some of these might need a little bit of updating. Hopefully there is one image here that is familiar to you. If not, just pause the video, Google memes, and find an image that is familiar to you, hopefully. And if you still feel confused, you're welcome to email me and I will give you a different example of a hermeneutical resource. Okay, so most of the time, if you're familiar with any of these images, you're going to see that image accompanied by some text, right? Like it captures a certain feeling, like a certain thing, right? People can put the text on it and it's like the combination of the text with the image, like the image almost functions as a kind of like tone or gives context in a way that isn't totally available if you just use your words, right? It gives you almost like this like immediate like visual experience where you're like, oh yeah, I know this feeling. Like I know this kind of like angry and this kind of reaction, for example, right? These memes you can understand as resources, right, for communicating certain experiences like grumpy cat, right? Like this, like it's a certain kind of grumpy. And when you use it as a meme to like express something that's going on, it just has a special way about it. It doesn't do the same work as like, oh yeah, like so and so is feeling grumpy today. Like making a joke about, you know, comparing somebody's behavior like to grumpy cat, it's going to have a much different tone than it would be if you just sort of like explained it in using just like the literal meanings of the words that you're using to explain it. So these work as concepts, again, for communicating certain experiences. And sometimes, like, actually, here, let's go back. If these memes are not at all familiar to you, I think especially if you're not really like, you don't really feel fluent in like the whole meme share stuff, right? Then you know exactly what it's like to not share overlapping hermeneutical resources with another person. If somebody sends you like a meme or a GIF or maybe makes a joke, like a, you know, like references like some kind of joke on like a TV show or something like this, and like you just don't get it. Perfect example. They have some, you know, especially those kind of like inside joke things or those things that like reference certain TV shows or whatever. That's a perfect example of like somebody has some conceptual resources for understanding something in a certain kind of way that don't overlap with yours. So when they try to talk to you about it, you don't get it, right? There's no communication fails. Lavelle Anderson understands that more broadly as an impasse. So an impasse in hermeneutical, like a hermeneutical impasse, or rather another way you can describe it is just like a gap in shared hermeneutical resources. This person has their set over there, there's their set over there, there's like, you know, this person has like all the meme knowledge, like they're like up on Reddit or whatever. And then like this person is totally not even into social media, barely looks at the internet. Like their resources that they have for like understanding, you know, somebody being grumpy that day are not going to overlap with this other person's. And as Anderson notes, or as he like, you know, as this like project more broadly, this concept of like non-overlapping hermeneutical resources, like recognizes right off the bat is like that is a huge all these different ways that essentially like our way of seeing the world, understanding it doesn't overlap with somebody else's. There's a bunch of different ways that that can work, right? And so one of the first really like obvious ways that that happens is in like situations where, you know, some of the baseline stuff that we need in order to communicate with one another isn't there, like a shared language. So Anderson refers to those kinds of impasses, like even like the words that we have function as tools, hermeneutical resources that we use, right, to convey information, literal meaning of words. So if you don't understand what somebody else's, you know, the literal meaning of like the word that somebody utters, right, because you don't share the same language, you're not fluent in one another's language, you're not sharing overlapping sets of hermeneutical resources that you rely on in order to communicate, right? Another place that we see this kind of impasse, like there's just like there's some, it's like some kind of definition problem, right? They don't know, like you don't know the word that like matches up with the thing that that word typically identifies, like say cat, right? Like if I, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but like somebody say I don't, you know, I don't know what gato means, like I'm not going to know if somebody's like referencing a cat, right? Like I don't, there's not shared hermeneutical resources when it comes to like, you know, me speaking English and the other person speaking Spanish or saying cat in Spanish, really. And so those are, so that's what we might call when there's like absolutely no shared language happening there. That's like kind of like first right out the gate, like communication isn't going to happen. Super, super obvious. Second, slightly less obvious, but still pretty obvious, is if there's, you know, there's like certain like slang or like a not people speaking two different dialects of the same language, where there's going to be terms that get used, like maybe, you know, they both understand like what reference, like what a cat is, but you get into other territory and like there starts to be a lot less overlap. And in those situations, like where someone like doesn't understand like a certain kind of slang or a certain kind of dialect, people share the same language, some like minimal stuff there, but so maybe they get out the gate, but pretty soon out the gate, there's not going to be a whole lot of space for like effective, successful communication. And I mean, I think that, trying to educate people that are like unfamiliar with, like, you could see this cropping up with a lot of different ways that tech gets used. I think at this point, probably everybody is like pretty familiar with, what a cookie is in terms of collecting your data. But, somebody like Cookie Monster, who really we can just assume is probably like not into the internet. He like definitely can't have a smartphone. Oh no, I guess he has some fingers, so he maybe could like work with a smartphone, but his hands are really fuzzy. Like it's not gonna like pick up his fingerprints. Also just not interested, right? And like going onto social media, like really only cares about cookies. So if, Cookie Monster is presented with the situation, like we're being like, oh, you want to like you protect your privacy, delete your cookies, right? Cookie Monster isn't really going to be picking up on, like what is actually happening in the computer there. So yeah, these are like pretty clear straight out the gate. There's not going to be a whole lot of effective, successful communication, information shared, right? Like producing knowledge, maybe, if you remember from the first part of the video. If people don't share the same language, or if they don't share, sometimes under certain circumstances, if like they don't share the same dialect. And for the most part, these kinds of impasses are pretty innocent, right? Like, it's not as if somebody doesn't want to engage with the information being presented to them. It starts to get into stickier territory when we move into a type 3 impasse. So type 3 hermeneutical impasses happen when there is no language barrier, right? Like same dialect, all the good stuff, but there's some kind of knowledge gap. And here, with the type 3 impasse like this, it's not super problematic, provided that somebody's trying to understand. So I think that at this point, based off of like the grading that I've done on the work in this class and things like this, it's pretty clear that everyone has had at some point a little bit of difficulty in understanding a certain concept in the class. And so far, all of those, examples I have in mind that I've witnessed, there's still a lot of effort trying to perhaps understand like what this concept of validity looks like, right? If you remember, sort of like way back when we were doing the first module period, and I was saying, we have this like standard day-to-day use of this term valid, like we kind of like use it interchangeably with like legitimate, things like this. And in this class, valid means something very specific. It is just about deductive arguments and whether just the structure of the argument, like the kind of evidence that we need in order to buy the conclusion of a deductive argument. And it valid in that way carries a lot less weight than valid actually does, like in our day-to-day life, right? It's just sort of like, yeah, in theory, if all the stuff you're saying is true, then like this conclusion sort of falls out, is entailed by the premises in your argument. And you can get pretty silly arguments from that. Some of you, or all of you, have seen rather at this point. And that sort of require, in order to get what I was saying, like picking up what I was putting out there with respect to this different notion of the word validity, like all of you work to try to like wrap your brain around that a little bit. And I would imagine that, it took a second to like really like shift when you like see it show up on the page, being like, okay, right, like in this class, like we use the word valid in a much different way than, you know, I'm like typically accustomed to using it. And you know, before getting to that point where you can like really shift it, right? When you're like initially like jumping in, listening to the lecture, writing about it, all that stuff, like probably some hermeneutical impasse of what's happening. Like, wait a second. No. Like, how could this like validity is the thing about like that being like legitimate, real, all the stuff, like that's like the like valid, full stop, like that's great, right? And then it's like, no. In this class, like valid isn't that sort of thing. So if you don't pick that up right away, right? Like not having that kind of concept, I can explain all the stuff about it. And I think as a lot of you saw, like doing it in practice, like really operating with that concept, like answering the questions on worksheets and stuff like this, like that took some work, it took some understanding. There was, for a lot of people, it was like confusion initially in the beginning. And in those beginning stages, it's a perfect example of the thing that we're talking about when we say, yeah, shared language, got it. You know, for the most part, like same dialect, like we got it. Communication is happening, but needed to acquire that concept of validity to really understand all the stuff that I was saying in the earlier lecture videos. So in that moment before, you know, prior to closing the gap, right? There was a gap there. Needed some closing. And it was an innocent gap, right? Everybody's working, nobody's like saying, like this kid in the corner over here just like tossing the book and being like, I mean, maybe you did, maybe you came back, everybody ended up like really nailing that idea well. So but I've definitely had, you know, there's other students, people I've known who've taken philosophy classes that have that kind of attitude when they run up against concepts like that, where it's like, okay, I see it, I don't get it, I'm not, I'm good, you know, like just walking away from it. And in those moments, seeing like that kind of impasse happening, going like, all right, somebody is handing me, right, like this concept, this fact about the world, some information that could produce knowledge, I'm going to chuck it. I don't want to deal. That is what we would call a willful hermeneutical impasse. So, to clarify, we have two types or two subtypes of a type 3 hermeneutical impasse. We have just type 3, and then we have a willful hermeneutical impasse. Okay, so just a quick note about willful impasses. Willful impasses happen when there's a break in understanding that is caused by a refusal. So again, I just wanted, this image is super useful, to engage with something that would lead to challenging encounters with unfamiliar hermeneutical resources, like being like, this valid thing, I don't get it, that makes more sense to me the way I use it, I'm good, bye, like walk away. And you know, I think that one of the things I really like about this image, right, is like this person like runs up against something that's unfamiliar. Being unfamiliar with stuff makes everybody uncomfortable, and a lot of times, a lot of us, depending on the circumstances, get a little bit defensive when we don't know about stuff. And you know, this is where it gets really tempting to just be like, oh, well, you know, like, I don't get it, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? Like, I think that if you can't recall in a time where you've done that personally, I would think that you could probably recall a time where you watched somebody else do that thing, where I'm being like, this is just too much, I'm not gonna, I just like come up with like, this is dumb, or you know, this is a like, it's a waste of time to have to like learn about this stuff. I think that for a lot of my life, far less so now, but I kind of felt that way about video games. Like I was just like, I don't get it. Like having to, but because you have to gain some knowledge, some like understanding of, you know, like what, even just like the buttons on controllers, like how those functions or how you go about playing certain video games, right? In order to like play those video games. And you know, for me, like that idea of like having to pick up that stuff, having to learn about it was like a little bit overwhelming. I'm like, whatever, like it's dumb, I don't, like, not worth my time. And I can look back on that sort of like younger version of myself and be like, oh, well, like it was just like you were a little intimidating because there's a lot of information out there, right, about video games. All right, so when willful hermeneutical impasses link up with prejudice, you have what Anderson identifies as a type 4 hermeneutical impasse, where there is a barrier in understanding due to prejudice that gives rise to a willful hermeneutical impasse. So, kind of like I was talking about with oppression, like similarly, like prejudice is a big old thing. There's like a bunch of different ways to define it. Anderson specifically, though, understands it as judgments that have positive or negative valence that display some resistance to counter evidence owing to some effective investment on the part of the subject, which is a very complicated way to saying there's like positive or negative association with like how someone appears or like an aspect of their identity. And despite evidence showing that, say, this person doesn't fit that particular stereotype, prejudice happens when a person's like, even though I'm seeing all this evidence to show that this person doesn't fit the stereotype, like I still see the stereotype. Sometimes this stereotype has has a positive connotation, has a positive association, or as Anderson calls it, positively valenced. That's like a term that often gets used in psychology, valence. And sometimes it has like a negative connotation, a negative association, or like Anderson says, like psychologists often say, is negatively valenced. So that's what we understand prejudice as is here. I want to be really clear. There's a lot of other ways to define prejudice, but for the sake of what we see as this sort of behavior where it's like somebody is essentially holding on so tight to something like a stereotype about someone's identity, right? Like a stereotype about like women, for example. That even though they're being presented with information that's like contrary to that stereotype, they're like, no, because women are this way, or like, oh, like how these feminists are, like, I'm not going to listen to that, right? And as a result of that, like, oh, I'm not going to listen to this, like, I'm going to insist on seeing this person in this way, they willfully refuse. But you can guess the rest of what I'm going to say or have like a sense of it. They willfully refuse to engage with something that leads to a challenging encounter, right? They willfully refuse to engage with some unfamiliar territory about something that say this woman is like trying to communicate to them. So this is kind of a like a sophisticated and nuanced way to sort of spell out the some of the processes by which prejudice like undercuts our communication with people. Because it's also something like this idea of prejudice is also something that, I think people oftentimes refer to as like a kind of bias that causes the person who is listening. So like you can imagine like the guy that like has like some like sexist beliefs about women, causes the person who's listening, or the interpreter, the person who's interpreting the words, to privilege certain uncharitable interpretations of the words that are coming out of the person who's speaking, the person who's trying to communicate, in the example, a woman, uncharitable interpretations of what that person is trying to say over more charitable ones. So it's sort of like these situations where there's like these rote responses to things that that people say, very much like the example that I gave about the ad hominem fallacy, like when a woman in a relationship is like trying to express like some issues that she's, say, like her partner's sort of like expecting her to do all of the laundry and wants her to like make dinner every night, despite the fact that like they both work full time, like, and she like works longer hours than he does, and like all this stuff. And he's just saying, well, this is the thing that women should do, so you need to figure it out, right? And she's finally getting sick of it, like really, really tired. And she's like, this is not okay. Like, I need you to step up. I need you to help out more. And he goes, oh, what? Is it this time of the month? Right? Like in that kind of exchange, that interpreter, the guy in this like example relationship, is favoring a much more like an uncharitable interpretation, right? Just like all over the place, doesn't make sense, things that she's upset about, right? That's how he's interpreting the words that she's saying. Instead of actually really listening to like, hey, like these assumptions that you have about these things I need to do, like that's not fair and that's not really good for our relationship. I'm super unhappy, right? Like instead of, seeing this person as an individual who this listener, this interpreter is like in a relationship with, just seeing her as like this like cookie cutter stereotype, almost like not really looking at the person directly in front of him, just this like imaginary kind of messed up version, like general kind of depiction of something she is, just based on like one part, like one aspect of her identity, right? And as a result, fails to really understand that she's saying like, you need to kind of like fix some of the beliefs that you have about the way our relationship should look like and like who I am in order to keep making this work. And, unfortunately, and this is another aspect of hermeneutical type 4 hermeneutical impasses. This is probably the most important aspect of type 4 hermeneutical impasses, these impasses that result in a kind of prejudice barrier, is that the response gives just enough room for the person who's interpreting it to say, no, I understood. So notice, and this is a really important difference between this kind of hermeneutical impasse and all of the other ones. In all of the other impasses that we talked about, right? So like, we got like no shared language. We have like, these issues with like dialect, or like somebody who's sitting in the class, like doesn't get the thing, doesn't, whatever, or is like trying really hard to understand it, all of those cases, all of those examples that we thought about there, those people, not once, not one of them is going to say like, oh yeah, I got it, I understood it, right? Like it's clear to some extent, it's explicit that there was some kind of failure in communication. The thing that really sets type 4 hermeneutical impasses apart is that the way, the sort of options, the kinds of normalized ways to have engaging conversation available to the person listening are such that they can claim that no impasse happened, right? And that, is pretty understandably pretty infuriating for the person on the other side, because it's like, no, you didn't understand. And then the person's there, judging you based off of like some, aspect of your identity, right? Like something like you can't change, and saying like, no, because like you're this kind of thing, you're this kind of way, like I did understand you, and I'm also not gonna like engage with that, the stuff that you're saying that actually really does matter. So yeah, so again, I just want to reiterate, these type 4 impasses, what sets them apart is that you have this prejudice barrier, right? Like you have like this kind of prejudice surrounding like insisting on seeing someone in a certain way, in a certain kind of light, where like you're really like, instead of really seeing them, you're seeing like this like more negative kind of depiction of them. And you misunderstand what they're saying as a result of that, because you refuse to engage with the resources necessary for really understanding what they're saying. But all the while, there's this response available that makes it seem like you did understand, or at least like there's like enough space to claim like, no, I did understand what you were saying. It's just that how women are, right? Like when they're on their period, like you're emotional, come on, right? It's like, no, you're not actually adopting like the resources necessary for understanding why, say like the person in the example I was that I gave just a second ago, like the woman is saying like, you need to change some of your attitudes about like the way that this relationship works in order, I'm really unhappy. Refusing to really like dig in and get what she's really putting out there, right? The knowledge, the experiences, the facts about the world she is trying to share, right? Not willing to pick up the resources necessary for really understanding that, but can still respond. There's like these normalized, it's like normal to just be like, well, oh no, I did. It's just because of the way that like you are, like you're pretty emotional, right? Like can still dismiss it. And one of the things that we really want to bear in mind when we're thinking about these examples is it makes a lot of space for people to appear as if they're trying to address like like big serious problems without actually having to do all of the work. So in a given example, I'll make my face as small as I can. You do not have to read all of this text. This is an example. This is a real case. This is a real university where there was a it was a graduate program, and it was a I think it was like a biology, it was like a graduate program in the biology department that required field work. And so the way that graduate students like fulfilled that part of their degree is they would they would stay in these cabins and like do their studies, collect their data, all that stuff. And like with this group of cabins, or rather there was like one professor that like kind of like oversaw this part, this work that was being done in the department. And just for context, this professor who was put in this position, there's like a long history where he was like getting fired from universities for sexual harassment, but the universities wouldn't tell his new job that that's why they fired this person. So like there's a lot of like this is a person with a long problematic history, this one professor. And finally at one point, one student in this particular program wanted to call it out. And so she had like she was like living in this little cluster of like cabins doing this research, I think for like close to, it was at least a year. So she's like spending a lot of time with this person. They had one another's phone numbers because like they're also like kind of sharing this living space. And so there's just like a lot, like there was like texting that needed to happen by virtue of the work that she was doing and his position as like her advisor and her professor. And there was like a lot of interacting where like they would like share meals and things like this. So when and there was a lot of stuff that he was doing that was like super inappropriate, and like to the point of like threatening her with retaliation, like if she like didn't like sleep with him and stuff like this. Yeah, just the full gamut of all of the horrible things that can happen under these kinds of circumstances where you have somebody who's like a predator. So she, so the student is like, okay, all this stuff's happening, gets to the point where she's like, you know what, that's it. Like, I don't care about my status in the department or my degree. Like, I can't put up with this anymore. I need to report him. And for those of you who don't know, there's an organization within every single university at Lehman also called Title IX. And what Title IX does is they address improper conduct that violates university standards between both students and professors. But it's like the Title IX department that whenever there's like, a student that's like reporting kind of like experiencing sexual harassment from like a professor or whatever, like Title IX is the one that deals with it. So she made this report. She like goes to Title IX, gives them all the evidence, gives them like a long, long text history between her and this professor with a bunch of really inappropriate stuff that he was saying, like about her clothing and how attractive he found her and all of this stuff. At one point in this long text exchange that was like printed out and given to the Title IX people, they found this text between her and the instructor where she had asked him if he had come into her room the night before, because she genuinely wasn't sure if she had a dream of him like standing over her, and he denied it, right? And I think that it's actually like pretty easy to imagine, like here she is, like whether it was like fabricated in her mind, like it was a dream, like it makes sense that she asked because she probably was feeling a lot of anxiety about this person since he did have a key to like the space that she was sleeping in. And so she had texted him at one point and asked him if he had come into her cabin at night. And she was like, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. He said no. So she was like, okay, cool. It was like a dream, whatever. That portion of the text exchange between them, she never brought it up to Title IX. There was like a plenty old long list of other really horrible things that he had done. But they went through and they read the whole text history. So after not hearing back from them, after handing them all of this evidence of things that really bad things that this professor was doing to her, she gets one of the first questions that they ask her is if they ask her is about the dream and like make this weird leap about maybe she dreamt all the other hard evidence that she was handing them about his inappropriate behavior, predatory behavior, because they wanted to know about the dream because they were wondering if she dreamed like this one place where she talks about a dream. She's not sure if he's in her room or not. She never brought that up as an issue with Title IX. And that's the piece that they pick on and they go, oh, we just want to ask because maybe you dreamed all this other stuff that happened, despite the fact they were like being handed a lot of evidence that like she most certainly wasn't dreaming it. So here, right, we have a pretty familiar narrative of women making up or over exaggerating the extent to which inappropriate, predatory, oftentimes violent behavior actually happened, right? Like, it's not to go as far as other kinds of narratives that we hear of like, oh yeah, she made it up. But like this sort of like, oh, well, you know, maybe she didn't really understand or she misinterpreted actually what he was saying. Like maybe it was just fabricated in her mind, right? And that kind of response can make it seem like, say, somebody at the Title IX office is really listening to the words that this person is saying, is like actually clearly reading like the whole text message thread and like and thinking about it, and nonetheless is not picking up the facts about our social world that this woman, the student, was putting out there, right? And so long time ago, another video when I was talking about knowledge practices, right? What we have happening in these reports in a Title IX office is a knowledge practice. And something that we unfortunately very oftentimes find is that people who are in vulnerable positions, sometimes it's women, it's like it can be other things like people because of like disability, other kinds of like power imbalances, like most certainly like skin color and things like this. People who are in vulnerable positions, there's like these reasons that like the heads of the Title IX office, and I'm not saying this happens at Lehman, this is just like a pattern that we see more on like on a national level. The people that are working in these Title IX offices have these like weird ways of both refusing to really pick up what vulnerably positioned people in society are trying to put out there about their experiences of like being harassed or assaulted, right? While simultaneously being able to say, no, I actually listened to you, right? It's a very sneaky kind of way that legitimate concerns, aspects of our social world that clearly need addressing because people are, we have, you know, we see the patterns of like groups of people experiencing harm simply because of their gender or simply because of their race, right? But these weird scripted ways by which the people that don't understand those experiences can dismiss them, not engage with them, adopt the hermeneutical resources, take on those challenging hermeneutical resources necessary for understanding those experiences. So in this way, the type 4 hermeneutical resources work as a way, or sorry, the type 4 hermeneutical impasses function in a way that exclude members of marginalized groups from producing knowledge in certain contexts. And as a result, that exclusion or consequence of that exclusion is that the people who are trying to like make these reports, like share their experiences, share that kind of knowledge, are put in this impossible position where it's like, okay, well, you know, either I like kick and scream in the Title IX office, right? And then everybody's like, well, you know, she's clearly out of her mind. Then she's not, we can't believe anything she says, right? Try to like push against that. Or go, okay, fine. And then like sort of like solidify the thinking in that Title IX officer that that kind of response is okay, right? Like impossible, damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation. And one of the things that makes it so frustrating and impossible is that space that the Title IX officer has to say, no, I really did listen to you, like I'm doing my job, right? And that being able to just it feeling like a normal acceptable thing to say to this student who's trying to report sexual harassment, and asking her if the whole thing was a dream, like that feeling like a normal thing functions as a real constraint on what that student can communicate with the world. In particular, her ability to communicate, you know, this person who's like actively harming her, like communicate, share that information, get that knowledge out there in people in order to like stop this person from hurting her and from her, you know, stop the thing that's like inflicting so much harm. And it's very, very subtle, and it's also very, very harmful. And it this thinking, or rather like the image, you know, I spend a lot of time on these images for this because I feel like these are a lot of complicated big long words that we're using, and in some ways there are pictures that can like do a much better job like describing it, right? So like one way to think about the thing that I am talking about here is sort of like it being acceptable for somebody to try to communicate something, get some message out there, and then it being acceptable for somebody to just hop up on a ladder and just paint right over it, being like, nope, that's good, right? And where this links up with oppression, where this links up with knowledge practices, and like where this links up with like language and communication, like our norms that surround communication more generally, it's is a lot of how like power structures work in our society, right? Like if we think of language and like these like norms or like conventions, or what's another like just like the kind of stuff that we consider to be like a regular way to engage in a conversation, right? If we think of those, like it's not necessarily just using the words itself and like the literal meaning of those words and stuff like that, but it's like the way that we talk about stuff and the way that we communicate stuff, like the sort of expectations, what we consider to be like polite, right? Communication, things maybe that might concern body language or tone. If we think of those kinds of constraints as a social practice, we should also think about how power and relations of power, like power hierarchies, like people who are in like higher positions, namely in society, can kind of constrain and dictate what counts as like normal, okay, acceptable communication and what doesn't. And in this way, these kinds of impasses, like these like available responses, these like normal ways of thinking and talking, communicating with one another, things that we consider normal in conversation, are we can describe those as like a part of the structure of the discourse more broadly. So this is the term that Anderson uses. He describes this as like impasses in conversation being a structure of discourse more broadly. Another way that you can understand that is like this normalized, regular seeming stuff that works in a way that is like available to people for them to use, is like acceptable, like considered like good and fine manners, these like auto responses maybe to things that people say that like are considered normal, okay, acceptable, that that ultimately help people maintain a willful ignorance concerning certain hermeneutical resources necessary for understanding other people's experiences, and in particular the experiences of people who operate or occupy like very vulnerable positions in society, or help sort of undermine people who belong, members of like oppressed groups, undermine their ability to like share that knowledge, get that information out there, get those facts about our social world out there. And this, so that's the those kind of those options, those go-tos, like this sense that like it's an okay thing, right, to ask like, well, maybe you made the whole thing up, right? Like that felt like even a reasonable thing to respond to, is something that is what Anderson describes as the it's a feature of the structure of discourse more broadly. And something he goes on to talk about is the people in position of power, or there are people who are in positions of power that can do a really good job essentially like normalizing this stuff, and then can frame conversations in ways that define what counts as like reasonable discourse. So one really good example of this, because I feel like I'm only giving you one example so far, and there's like a bunch of different ways that this stuff gets realized, is, and this is something that you all will be thinking about a little bit more, is, and this is the example that Anderson starts out with in the paper, right, is this response to the Black Lives Matter protest chant that some people have in saying, no, all lives matter, right? So when you have like one person saying Black Lives Matter, and then you have the other person saying, no, all lives matter, right? Like that feeling, that being available as considered to be a legitimate, not only a legitimate response, or rather critique of Black Lives Matter, but also a claim to understand what that protest chant actually means. And as soon as we dig in there, it doesn't take long to really look at, there is a lot of willful hermeneutical ignorance, or willful ignorance of those hermeneutical resources necessary for understanding the experiences that gave rise to that protest chant in the first place, right? Because the claim is most certainly not, and Anderson explains this really well, if you need a refresher, it's just in the first couple paragraphs of the paper. He says, this is not meant exclusively. This is not meant to say Black Lives Matter more. It's meant to say Black Lives Matter as much, right? And it's, of course, it is a given. It presupposes, that chant presupposes that there are a lot of different aspects of society where like Black lives are not treated as if they matter as much as specifically white lives. Like it is assumed, it presupposes that all lives matter in order to just have this complaint in the first place, that there are some lives that are being treated as if they matter less than other lives, right? So that kind of response totally, what it does is it's like this willful misinterpretation, right? It's privileging a really uncharitable, dismissive response over the right kind of response to the protest chant. It's saying like, no, what you're actually saying is like, they matter more. It's like, no, that's not what's being said here, right? Nonetheless, and as you know, we like see the all lives matter like as a bumper sticker, or like blue lives matter and that sort of thing, you know, in different contexts, like in our day-to-day lives. As we every time that we see those those kinds of responses, what we see is somebody who is just willfully refusing to look at, like, okay, what is actually going into this argument, right? And then this is where we come back around to why this is important when we're talking about critical reasoning. Like, what is the argument here? Like, what is the evidence being provided here, right? Is this the kind of evidence roughly that we want to support the conclusion being made? And importantly, with respect to the stuff that we were thinking about in the earlier video on epistemic oppression, we also want to be thinking about who are the kinds of experts that, who are the experts in this situation that know about the evidence to give? Like, who are the ones that are best capable of giving us good evidence that, you know, we have a problem in our society with anti-Black racism, right? And if those things are taken into account and they require, you know, if like you're someone, especially like if you're a white person and, you know, you've never experienced any kind of racism, and say like you know, like you were raised in like a conservative environment, and they're like, you don't know, there's like no like Black people in your community, don't really like engage with any of that stuff, right? If you're someone in that kind of, if you're positioned in that way, it might be kind of uncomfortable to be like, oh wow, there's like people who experience this, like regularly experience this like harmful and frustrating and like really scary thing because of the color of their skin. I don't, you know, because of like my skin color, like I don't know what that is like, but I will listen to them to hear about it. Like that's not, you know, taking those steps for a lot of white people has proved to be like, you know, I think we've seen like difficult sometimes. Looking at that, being like, oh wow, I have this kind of privilege, and that like I don't have to experience this thing. Maybe some guilt around, you know, accidentally like contributing to that sort of thing. So having to look at that and the reasons behind this Black Lives Matter chant, right? Having to engage with some stuff that might make a person uncomfortable, but they have to engage with it in order to really understand what's happening in the argument, to actually think critically about what is being discussed, be logical, as some of you might say, or like, I mean, really like more colloquially, like smart about it, like really look at the argument and see what's being said and looking at the evidence. Instead of doing that, latching on to a prejudiced reading of what that protest chant means. And ultimately, in doing so, really excluding the experts in the conversation about what anti-Black racism looks like and what needs to be acknowledged in order to address it in this country. So hopefully, and this is a basic summary of the quote in the first paragraph. If you want to like take a closer look at that, you're welcome to do so. And you know, ultimately, what I actually, here we'll go back for a second. Yeah, what I hope that this has helped you come to see is really like when we think about like big, large scale social problems, like matters of what we might call like urgent social concern, like big problems. And you know, big groups of people that are like experiencing harm that shouldn't, not that anybody should, but like these patterns, right? The stuff that we were doing in the first module period, although probably seemed like dry and I was like nitpicky about like numbering the premises and all of that stuff, that is one way, not the only way by any means, but that is one way that we can start to sort of at least like harness one way of thinking critically about things to really call out these problems and recognize the ways, not just in which people can be like manipulated, maybe like, you know, dealing with privilege, looking at that, feeling some insecurity, some concern, maybe that you like overstepped or made, you know, did something racist at some point, or misogynistic or ableist, homophobic, like engaged in some kind of social practice, like taking that kind of responsibility and that kind of discomfort. Doing that sort of thing. I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, trying to like practice real compassion and thinking about where other people are coming from when you're unfamiliar with like the position that they're in. Those sorts of things are not only important when it comes to being a good critical thinker, right? that's also one of the ways, again, just one of the ways, not the only ways, that we can really start to like call out, address, acknowledge, think about like some like pretty big problems in society. And it's just part of the story. I'm not saying that critical reasoning is going to solve all of our problems. It most certainly won't. But at the very least, this is sort of the purpose and the thinking behind me, putting you through it in having to like only use validity in a certain context and things like that. Okay, so on to the extra credit portion of this lecture video. All right, here, and again, this is due the same day as the other extra credit option, August 6th, and will also be worth up to 3 extra credit points. I want you to give your own example of a willful type 4 hermeneutical impasse. By another example, what I mean is it cannot be an example I have talked about in this class, and it cannot be an example that Lavelle Anderson talks about in his paper, and it cannot be an example that Brianna Toole talked about in the podcast, and it cannot be any examples that Christy Dotson talked about in her podcast. It has to be your own example of a willful type 4 hermeneutical impasse. I'm gonna be real. I want to like, this is an opportunity for people that like gears got turning about this, being like, oh wow, maybe this thing that I saw, or this interaction on the news, like that might be one of those things. Don't worry about if it doesn't fit every single little thing I talked about. I know there's like a lot. This is a big, dense, heavy subject, and this is a very fast-paced class. Normally, students have like over a month to kind of think through these concepts. So don't overthink it too much. Just try to put something down, latches on to, it tracks with some of the stuff that I was talking about in the video if you choose to take on this extra credit option. And then what I want you to think about after you give your example is what would need to change in the public discourse to prevent this from happening in the future, okay? So it's like problem, and then like just roughly off the top of your head, again, really off the top of your head here, don't worry about getting this perfectly right, what you think would need to change. And then lastly, giving an example where somebody in a position of power controlled the narrative. So this would be an example of, somebody who kind of like sets an example that people follow in terms of a way to like engage in conversation. And that sort of example that people are following normalizes this behavior that ultimately results in people willfully refusing to pick up on the hermeneutical resources, like wrap their brains around the stuff that they have to wrap their brains around that's necessary for understanding someone else's experience. So those are the extra credit options. And again, like the other extra credit options, if you want to do this, you'll need to just submit that to me via email, right? Not tacked on to like any of your other assignments. And if you have any questions, again, I just want to reiterate, I know these are a lot of big, heavy, dense subjects or topics or concepts, really, like I still run into my own hermeneutical impasses with the literature on this subject. And I have been teaching this module period like for years now. It's a big thing. It gets realized in so many different ways. So if something doesn't make sense to you, or if you're not sure if you got an idea right or something like this, if you're not feeling great about an example, you are more than welcome to email me, or even at the very least, like if you get to the end with your module worksheet for this module period, and you're like really struggling with it and feeling really insecure, after you submit it, you can even like email me and say, like, hey, Leah, I was really struggling like with this particular concept. I'm not sure if I got it right. I just want to let you know, like I was working really hard on it, and like I still like I feel really confused about it, something like that. So at the very least, like you can just like shoot me an email, let me know if you're not feeling like super confident about your understanding of it, and like we can potentially work from there and making sure that you at least start to get those initial steps in wrapping your head around this stuff. All right, so that about does it for this module period's lecture videos, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their week.